First, I'd like to acknowledge the Betugal people, traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to Indigenous people, both past and present, and extend that to Indigenous people who are present in the audience today. I'd also like to warmly acknowledge all the Indigenous people who really are the backbone for what I'm going to be talking to you about today. This story really originated in a remote Indigenous community in the Northern Territory, and young Indigenous people have really thrown themselves into being part of this body mapping story, and it's been an incredibly rich experience because of the sort of insights that they've put into this. So I've called this Asking the Tricky Questions, talking about young people, about sex and relationships. I mean, you know, anyone who's done work with young people, you know that, you know, talking things about, you know, tell me about your health, tell me about what you do, tell me about your behaviours, is a really, really hard question to ask. You know, people just don't like being asked those sorts of questions. And they're not things that people really want to engage with. You throw sexuality and relationships into that sort of mix, and, you know, it's incredibly hard. It goes from sort of really hard to like super impossibly hard. But in fact, the things that I'm going to talk to you about today are really in response to how difficult those sorts of questions are, and how difficult it is to engage with young people about those sorts of questions, and how we as a team actually responded to that. And our example today is around sexuality and relationships, but really, as we've been talking about this morning, the applications for this method are incredibly wide-ranging. Oh, thanks, Laura. Hey. So this is where this all started out. This is the community of Wunuko in the Northern Territory. It's a large community by Northern Territory standards, in fact, the third largest. That being said, there's 900 people live there. There's a really big river full of crocodiles on that side, which means that, you know, for doing your risk management for going out to the field, really complicated. But for young people living in these sorts of communities, it can be incredibly isolating, because that river particularly means that for 6 months of the year that community is cut off. You know, it's really difficult to get contact with the outside world. And it was in this community where I started work as a much younger person in 1998. And my job was to work with the young women to talk about their life aspirations, and then move into sort of discussions about pregnancy. The average age for childbearing in this community is 15. So it was of great concern to a lot of people that young women were having babies incredibly young. And to work with them to talk about their relationships, their sexual health, their pregnancies, and, you know, what sort of things they wanted from their lives. And as a result of this, I published a series of papers, and the Northern Territory government, quite surprisingly for them, that shouldn't be reported, but anyway, but we were sort of onto it and said, hey, you know, that's great, you know, you've really looked into the lives of these young women in some detail, you know, we're really learning stuff from this. Could you just replicate this in communities right across the Northern Territory, and maybe you could do Western Australia and South Australia as well, because they're part of our tripartite agreement. And that couldn't be terribly hard. Could you have it done in 3 years, please? You know, and the point for me was that I'm an anthropologist. We don't do things like that. You know, I sit in a community for 3 years and think about things, and this is a big ask. And, you know, I was, you know, suddenly forced out of my comfort zone to think about, well, okay, I've got now not years or months to engage with young people. I've got minutes or maybe an hour at the best. You know, how am I going to do that but still retain that sort of rich ethnographic data? I don't want to do research that doesn't generate, you know, important and grounded and sort of person-centric information. You know, how am I going to do that when, you know, you just don't have that time to build relationships? And how we did that is sort of the story of how body mapping, you know, came to being for us. You know, and we were suddenly forced from, you know, doing work that was very familiar to me, sitting on the side of the river and talking to people, to thinking about, oh, you've got an hour in a health class, you know, how are you going to do it? And not only that, you've not only got an hour in a health classroom, but you've got a teacher sitting up the back monitoring every single thing you say, you know. Suddenly the whole research environment became just a little bit more complicated. Next switch. Oh, thank you. So we were familiar with the work done with HIV/AIDS in South Africa and the Living with X project, and the way that body mapping was being used there to really tease out, you know, complex and rich stories about the experience with living with HIV. And I thought, well, you know, maybe we can start to use this technique to engage with the young people we're working with. So, you know, we got ourselves armed with lots of paint and paper, and off we go, we can do this. And our first attempts weren't quite as successful as we planned. You know, we tried to structure a conversation around sexuality and relationships, but in fact, there was just so much going on for these kids that their body maps just had every single thing they could possibly put on them. And this one's got a crocodile, a cat there, it's got multi-plights, it's got smoking, it's got eating disorders, it's got, you know, everything is happening to this body. I've got a little bit of everything and not much depth about anything at all. And although we produced a series of really quite startling and often really beautiful artworks, they were really getting to the sort of the depth of the problem. I wanted to learn about people's embodied sense of relationships and sexuality. This just didn't do it. It wasn't getting there. So we had to sort of go back to the drawing board again to think about, you know, how we could sort of hone the technique again to try to get these rich stories out. The other really important barrier that we came across in the Northern Territory particularly, where sex education is minimal, to say the least, was the fact that people had very, very little experience of sex ed, and when they did, it was really, really bad. You can read that one. One of the standard approaches that people had with sex ed was to take what I used to call the pus pictures, and they used to take them out and just show people what they could possibly get, like the gonorrhea thing. You know, here's another disgusting picture. You know, you wear that condom or you get that. You know, so, you know, the young people we talked to were really, really disengaged with their sex education too. They said, you know, this is just rubbish. You know, all they talk to us about, the organs, the anatomy stuff, it's not telling us what we need to know. You know, we want to know about the complexity of relationships. We want to know about what it feels to be jealous and how to deal with those sorts of things. Why don't people talk to us about that stuff? So again, you know, when you're coming into groups of young people from, you know, under the sort of sex ed banner, you're being labelled with all of this stuff. You know, this is what's come before you. And it's quite a big job to extricate yourself from this and say, no, we're actually interested in something quite different. We're interested in a much broader understanding of what sexual health could possibly mean. So, the next stage in our development of body maps was to think, okay, what we need is something concrete. We need a story that's going to be the focus for our body maps. We need to have something that's going to generate people's interest, but keep them a little bit focused on the topic in hand. And so what we did is, from all our previous ethnographic engagement with young people, we generated a series of scenarios, and they were really, really simple stories about, you know, sorts of situations that young people could get themselves into. And what we did is we used these scenarios to be the basis for our body mapping. So this formerly sort of nameless, unstoried person suddenly had a story that they were actually living and going through. And this made a huge difference in what we were doing, because it wasn't just a paper person anymore. You know, it was Rebecca, it was Dylan, it was somebody who people were actually relating to and actually, you know, reasonably concerned about what was actually going to happen to them. So this person who was, you know, formerly sort of nameless now had a name and a backstory and a sort of series of things that they were actually going to go through. And this made the huge difference. Having the scenario and the body mapping together, we suddenly were able to produce these incredibly rich and detailed stories about young people's sexuality. So what we get in the body mapping technique is we get a visual story. So there's a visual narrative going on here, but we also get an oral narrative as well. So you get a story being told at the same time, and both sets of information are incredibly important. But it's also very important to understand that these are intersecting sets of information. So one is feeding or generating the other. So they can't be seen in isolation. Young people also work in their body mapping activity in groups. So it's also sort of a cumulative narrative. So one person's ideas build onto another person's ideas. And so, you know, as a researcher sort of analysing this sort of information, it actually becomes incredibly complex. So you're getting very, very rich information when people's ideas and someone says, oh, no, it's like this, and, you know, and the whole narrative can change. And it's very important to be able to record when that happens and be able to say what is actually happening. The same thing with the bodies themselves. They're also this sort of evolving pictorial narrative. In the case of Dylan here, I can say a lot about Dylan, but before I say lots about Dylan, at one point, the young men who were describing him seemed to have this sort of a moment of incredible sort of insight, and they said, "Oh, the way he treats women, he's got no respect." You think, oh, hallelujah! You know, this is a moment. And then his friends sort of looked him up and down and said, "Nah, I do what I want," you know. So it was immediately countered, that moment there. You know, he's a cool kid, and then someone said, "No, he's not that cool," you know. So it's a bit of an evolving narrative, and again, that sort of shows you the complexity of what's going on here. There is a lot more in these sorts of things. The body maps we got out of this particular project are incredibly gendered. Dylan here, he's pretty typical of the blokes we got. He's got rippling muscles. As someone pointed out, he actually has a sort of 8-pack, but hey. He's smiling, he's confident, he's surrounded by all the broken hearts, he's got a really cool pair of shades on, and he's looking pretty pleased with himself. In fact, you know, he's thinking score. He's quite pleased with himself. This is despite the fact that he has a very, very large pubic louse climbing out of his trousers here. So his quite obvious STI isn't affecting him at all. You know, so invariably our young men were pictured in such a way. You know, they're looking pretty good. Their stories about their relationships are around sort of, you know, scoring, doing well, having lots of girls. You know, that's a way to measure your masculinity was, you know, part of this particular narrative. In contrast, our young girls are often depicted in incredibly scanty clothing. In this case, her nipples are showing, often genitals are showing, you know, because they're involved in this sort of discourse around sexuality and STIs, they're immediately labelled by both girls and boys as being slutty, as being, you know, sort of not like us. And the sorts of words that are used to describe her, you know, around being Rebecca's a slut. Well, why? Rebecca had sex with Dylan. That's what she did, you know. And you have this conversation, Rebecca's a slut. No, Dylan's cool, but Rebecca's a slut. At one point, you can also see an evolving narrative here. She said that Rebecca's feeling sad and nervous, and I'm a bit worried about it because she's a bit worried that she might be pregnant. Of course, she's feeling sad and nervous. That's concerning. And then immediately someone said, "Nah, ha ha, serves her right. She gets what she deserves," sort of thing. So again, a very remarkably unsympathetic portrayal of the woman here, who's also described as using up Dylan. There he is as this little sort of tiny little stick figure near her leg there. She's also described as having no self-respect. Here's another depiction of Rebecca. And this was done by a group of boys who initially, in their drawing of Rebecca, the first thing they drew was her sort of scrambled looking brain and said, "Oh no, she's really worried." No, they were actually worried about it. So they said, "Oh, she might be pregnant. We're feeling worried about her. What's she going to do?" That's very stressful, And then as the story emerged and they decided that Rebecca wasn't actually pregnant, but she did have an STI, their approach to Rebecca completely changed. And the first thing they did was draw the full sleeve tattoo on her arms. And this is, they said, "Oh, Rebecca has tattoos because she's a rebel." But what they're actually saying was, Rebecca is as much not like me, She is so different. It's only people who are different who get STIs, not like me, no. I'm young, clean and safe were the words that they kept on repeating to each other and to us. People who get STIs don't look like us. Then the STI itself is drawn as this sort of amorphous mass in her genital region. Again, she's described as being stinky because of this disease. She also has a bruise, and we often got body maps with bruises on them. And you say, "Well, what's going on here?" "Oh, well, that's just the way they had sex, People get bruises. They might have been a bit rough. There was no censoring going on here. There was, that was in their narratives. This was, part and parcel of a young couple having sex. In this case, for the first time. You don't know how they did it. She's described as a thug. She's got thug life across her arms. Again, that distancing sort of technique about making her as different as possible to me, because, I don't have an STI, but she does. She's not like me at all. Actually, go back to this week. What was I going to say here? Yeah, and in all of this, the story that was coming out about Rebecca was the fact that, we consider that people who are known, who are familiar, it's a very familiar story to sex educators, people who are known, familiar, who look clean, who we grew up with, you couldn't possibly get an STI from. Young people say to it, "But I went to the same daycare as this person. I'm not going to get an STI from them. Our mums are friends. No STIs for us, no." This is despite the fact that, 30% of the youth population in Darwin alone, had an STI at that particular time, which is why the huge amount of governmental concern. So they were saying, they were consciously constructing this place of safety where being young and being clean and not sleeping with people who are different or from outside, and outside could mean, down the road in Palmerston, equated to a sense of personal safety. This was despite the fact they were an incredibly high-risk group. So you can imagine, a way that sort of very stigmatised view of STIs builds up through these sorts of attitudes. And then you get stories about how young people are completely disengaged from going to sexual health services. Well, you would be too, because to go through that door means that you, somewhere under your clothes are looking a little bit like this. You are different, you've done something wrong, and it's going to be manifest in your body, and people are going to know. And you say, "Well, would you go to Clinic 34? no way would we go to Clinic 44. I'd have to wear a disguise to go to Clinic 34 because everybody would know that I had an STI. And to have an STI is to be defined as being from that outsider group, not part of the insider group. Just to add to the whole complexity of the thing, the Sexual Health Service in Darwin, has anyone been to Darwin? Yeah, do you know where they're, okay. You know Mitchell Street where all the pubs are? Pub. In the middle of that is Health House. It's got Hog's Breath on one side and a place called the Lost Ark on the other side. And in the middle, you have to walk past the security guard. Through the door, there is the STI clinic. So everybody sitting out here on the pavement can see you walking through the door. So, there is a reason why nobody goes to these clinics. One is that young people in Darwin have constructed this, incredible, story about A, why they're safe, and B, why people who do have an STI are, consciously dirty, and because, you are so conspicuous as well. So, in terms of these body maps, I have 171 of these, which is sort of an enduring legacy that is hard to pack and I have to carry around and stuff. We really need to think about a way to store these things and to do something constructive with them, maybe wallpaper or something. The stories that are coming out of this 171 are actually quite similar. They lack a huge amount of sympathy. They are very, very gendered, and young women particularly are incredibly vulnerable and are blamed for getting their diseases. And in a way, with what we know about sort of adolescent psychology, it's probably not that surprising. There is the emphasis on in-group conformity and the tendency to exclude people who are different. It's incredibly strong in this group. That rigid black and white descriptions of people. You either fit in or you don't fit in. It was coming through so strongly in our body maps. We're like this, and people who got an STI like this. No way we're like that. And the fact that their skills to have empathy are still developing. They haven't got a fully adult sense of how to be empathetic. And certainly in these body maps, they didn't show a great deal of empathy. They were remarkably callous. They were actually chillingly callous. I show these to the sexual health educators around the country, and they go, "Oh God, here's Kate with her downer pictures again." But they were incredibly important because these were the things that were maintaining these very high levels of STIs and meaning that people weren't accessing services. And on top of all this stuff, we're still dealing with a taboo subject area. Sexuality, still something really difficult to talk about. And on top of all of that is the fact that these particular kids received either really crappy sex education or no sexual education at all. So all these things are combining to produce these incredibly polarised and very unsympathetic views of young people who either got pregnant or got an STI. The other thing that's interesting about this is our scenarios were nothing in our scenarios suggested that they had to have a negative outcome. There were a couple that might have been seen as a bit negative. There were a couple that were entirely positive, and there were some that were sort of neutral. But every single one of them, 171 of these, no one went on to have a happy, consensual, loving relationship. They all were fraught with drama and chaos, and every single negative outcome you could think of that was not directed by us. This was the stories that were coming to us from the particular group. Nevertheless, this particular part of the project revealed so much information that I'm still, 5 years later, still writing it up. I think it's onto its 9th paper or something now, so it did generate some very interesting stuff. Key to this was young people's vulnerability in relationship, particularly young women. they often talked about the fact that they, you know, I've said before that there's quite a lot of physical violence evidence in our body maps, and they were often talking about the fact that they would be prepared to put up with quite a lot of physical violence to maintain their relationship, because they knew that young men could be fluid and move around particular relationships. So, you know, they were very, very vulnerable, and their reputations were very vulnerable too, because, you know, they could be exposed on Facebook or be labelled a slut at any point, you know. So, that, you know, everything was particularly fraught for young women. The stories of risks and stories of pleasure could not get young people to talk about pleasure. It couldn't prod them to talk about pleasure. You know, they just weren't doing it. I've said it a lot of times, you know, the extreme mistrust of the sexual health service. In Darwin, it was because of that one in the middle of the city. In more remote clinics, it was like, well, the only reason why a young person would go through those doors is they're pregnant with an STI, so they'll know, and my auntie will know, and then my mum will know, and that's all, you know. And the expectation and tolerance of violence within relationships, you know, very, very strong in our stories, and considered, you know, completely unshocking. You know, young people were telling these stories of violence in relationships and what they were prepared to put up with, you know, without, you know, and you say, really? You say, no, that's just normal, you know. So there was completely uncensored, these sorts of stories. So, you know, at the end of this, as I said, it was incredibly rich. But I had a lot of concerns about the method that we're using, the sorts of information it was generating, because it was still producing very extreme stories of sexual health. You know, as I said, we couldn't get the stories of pleasure. You know, the incredible lack of sympathy with people with STI, and that desire to create distance, you know, not like me, I'm safe, not them. So while they were great for generating research information and, you know, the insights I get into young people's worlds through using these body maps, you know, was, you know, the most detailed information I could possibly hope for. As an educational resource, they became incredible. They were much more limited because people weren't connecting to there wasn't enough empathy with these people to be able to say, okay, you know, how could we look after this person? How could we support them? How do they get to the next stage in their life? How do we work through this? They weren't interested, because all they wanted to do was make themselves as different as possible from these people. So their creation of distance meant that I couldn't get them to have any sort of empathy for what their character was actually thinking or feeling. Which leads us, I think, to the next stage in the whole body mapping thing, which Laura is going to take you through.
So we needed to think of a way to capture the rich story potential of the body mapping tool, but reduce the stigma and intensity of STIs and other relationship issues in an extremely polarised way. So in doing so, we developed the Life Happens resource. We have it here today, so we'll show you it at the end. So adolescents are predisposed in group behaviours and disinclined to identify with persons who does not comply with their own norms or behaviour or threatens their constructions of safety. There are ways to build empathy, however, and a way that has particular resonance with our study is the use of narratives to help young people explore a range of different life situations. We retain the process of utilising hypothetical scenarios, but put a much greater emphasis on character development by developing a series of value questions, such as the ones shown there. So who does this person love? Who is this person's family? What is this person thinking, watching and wearing? What is this person's weakness and strengths? What inspires this person? And how does this person feel their personal space? So each character was didn't have a gender, so the group could choose what they wanted to identify them as. So each group, which consisted of about 5 to 6 participants, were given 5 life cards, in which 3 were required to be incorporated into their chosen narrative, either being positive or negatively framed. So these are only some of them we have. How much do we have?
117, yeah.
So the process of life cards were designed to emphasise the unpredictability of life and relationships and the need to work through problems and issues which arise. The random life events which arise, for example, are shown. So one of them is a condom splits, you get an overseas job offer, you are trying to fall pregnant and you find a soulmate. So we gave this to third-year design students at the University of Wollongong, and they designed each one of these life cards. So there was a lot of effort put through. So we gave young people more time to develop their character, which allowed them to develop a greater level of sympathy, empathy and connection towards their character through its development stage. The most intricate differences which we saw were that adolescents immediately clothed their characters. They generated the narrative emphasis on their character and their relationships within the context of their everyday lives, and not just on their character's sexuality and sexual organs, which was found previously. The emphasis on character development and opportunities too became immersed in an unfolding story, which gave the participants the chance to be transported into a story, which increased them to engage in an empathetic way with their character they developed. In the previous Our Lives project, the young people in the stories were depicted invulnerable and alone because of the stigma associated with their conditions, whereas in the Life Happens project, they tended to talk to their friends and were given support and where they could access it through other organisations. So the Life Happens tool has an educational potential by allowing young people to think seriously about the options of help and support which are available within their community settings. In most cases, the young participants ensure that their character had a happy ending, but if not, tried to find a way to make this happen through becoming empathetic with the character they created throughout their story. The young participants made a point to create a high level of empathy in relation to their character's development and reflected on this during their in-depth discussion about their character and the decisions that were made during their life. So I'll show you an example. So this is Chris. It was designed by a group of young girls. So Chris is defined as good. He had a difficult childhood due to an absent father. He had his first sexual relationship with a young woman and didn't use a condom. Chris was worried about it and sent the young girl a text message. He also worries that he didn't enjoy his first sexual experience and may be more attached to men. The group of young girls talked at length about Chris's feelings and were worried that he might feel like a bad person. The young girls talked about the ways forward for Chris and presented it in terms of talking to friends and talking to support services which may be able to help him. And in this case, they talked about Headspace, which is a free use service for young people. So both projects revealed rich information about young people's sexual health and their decisions regarding sexual health and relationships. However, the educational usefulness of the Our Lives project was reduced by the tendency for extreme and negative depictions of unsafe sex. In contrast, Life Happens' emphasis was on character development and the realisation that events in the form of life cards life cards were random and could happen to anyone, resulting in the depiction of characters who were not othered and for who there was considerable degree of empathy and consideration. The format of Life Happens allowed for an unfolding story to be revealed and created. It appears that the immersion of the narrative allowed greater opportunities for young people to feel sympathy for their character. The stories which emerged in this context were ones where young people thought seriously about their stories and where support could be given and that a happy ending would occur. Young people are happy to engage in in-depth discussions about their character as well as their character's decisions, enhancing the potential for Life Happens resource to be an educational tool through the development of reflection. That's it.